I think there's a whole world of metrics to be unlocked if we looked at things a little bit differently. Yeah, maybe curveballs. We got to be a little bit more careful with curveballs than we do with fastballs. So the key takeaway is that batters are gaining information about ball flight from the delivery itself.
Jimmy, welcome to the Tread Podcast. Good to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Ben. This is awesome.
Awesome, man. Well, I guess just real quick before we dive in, we have a lot to cover today. For people who don't know your background, can you give us like the quick overview of how you got to this point and what your background is?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, always loved baseball, loved sports in general, loved math and science. You know, when I was a kid, I would read books like The Science of Pitching. I think Tom House wrote that book, like, I don't know, 20 or 30 years ago.
Right.
And I read it as a kid to teach me how to pitch. So I always loved sports, math and science. Undergraduate degree was mechanical and aerospace engineering. Didn't realize at the time how useful it would be for understanding ball flight later on. I thought I was going to work on airplanes, honestly. I had an internship at GE Aviation on working on airplane engines. But then I decided I wanted to study biomechanics. So I got a PhD in biomechanics where I specifically studied the baseball pitching motion. And so finished that in about 2014, 2015. And at that time, I was hired by the Dodgers to basically build out their pitching biomechanics capabilities. So it involved like installing markerless motion capture, figuring out how we were going to use it, figuring out how to make reports for the coaches. So yeah, basically worked with a bunch of awesome people to build out the Dodgers pitching biomechanics department from 2015 until the end of 2019. Then the end of 2019, I left the Dodgers to start Reboot Motion. And here at Reboot Motion, we created a buzzword term, biomechanics as a service is what we do. So we're not really a motion capture company, though we have motion capture capabilities. What we really are trying to do is be the best in the business at analyzing motion, at giving biomechanical analyses to coaches so coaches can use those analyses to make players better. And that's where we are today.
Awesome. So you guys are now in kind of consulting, the consulting mode for a number of pro organizations at this point, correct? So you're basically helping with interpreting what a lot of these numbers really mean.
Yeah, it's actually more than consulting. It's consulting plus software as a service. So we do work with a bunch of pro teams, a couple of college teams now, a couple of academies, and the way we our offering works is the customer uploads their motion capture data to us. Our analysis software processes it, dumps out metrics that they can then do data science on top of. It also dumps out reports that the coaches can use. And then I do spend a lot of time with the coaches, the front office, helping them understand how to best use it and interpret it. But ultimately, the goal is to educate so that they don't need me. So they can use reports and the metrics to do what they need to do. And then I can just continue to build cool software and cool analyses.
Sure. Awesome. So you were kind of in that first frontier of motion capture in pro ball. Then the Dodgers are one of the very first teams to begin trying to build a true like motion capture lab, correct?
Well, so actually it wasn't a lab, it was in the stadium. So the very first thing that we did was install, I think this is public knowledge, a markerless motion capture system in Dodger Stadium. So we installed Kinetrax. So I know a lot of people tend to first go to, we need a lab. But when I got to the Dodgers and Kinetrax already existed, my thing was if we have the ability to analyze in-game data, like let's prioritize doing that. The problem in a lab environment is you don't know if that's what the person is doing in competition, especially when you use a marker-based system. Like when a person has to strip naked and then put all these, dots all over their body. Are they doing what they would do on a mound if they had clothes on and they didn't have these dots all over their body? I'm not so sure. So at the Dodgers, our first thing was let's get an in-game biomechanics.
Awesome. So just real quick, going over kind of the evolution now that you've like been on the inside, now back on the outside, but still having some involvement with pro organizations. Like how far do you think they've come? And then what would be some areas where they still need to improve or kind of the next frontier for player development? Is this, like what you're working on right now, which is the interpretation of what these numbers actually mean and how to apply it to pitchers? Where can they continue to get better? Where do you see the next 10 years going from a pro standpoint?
Yeah, I still think, I mean, I think we're doing, we being biomechanists, like in Major League Baseball, are now doing an awesome job of collecting lots and lots of data. I still think a lot more needs to be done to make it interpretable. And at Reboot Motion, that's what we really focus on, is like, how do we make it actionable? That's like our big thing, is like actionability. Because I think there's a trap that a lot of people, so the thing is, a lot of biomechanists, they go into the pro sports world from a research background. They have PhDs in biomechanics, and then um, they tend to really hyper focus on the research aspect of it. They tend to hyper focus on, we need to do all of the validations to make sure this thing is accurate to within a millimeter before we can give any recommendations. But the thing is, like, you can give like solid recommendations without knowing if your motion capture system is accurate within a millimeter.
Right, right,
So I think still, a lot of people in the pro sports world tend to uh, focus a ton on making this like research grade biomechanics. And where I come out on it is like, let's actually really focus on making it actionable.
right.
This gets into like the debate between marker-based motion capture and marker-less motion capture. We want millimeter accuracy. Yeah, maybe we need a marker-based system. But if we want the most actionable data, then maybe we need a marker-less system. So that's where I think we can continue to get better, is focusing more on the actionability as opposed to the accuracy and like the research.
Right, and that's something that you and I have talked about in private. Is Trey, we don't have a motion capture lab yet. That's something we're moving
Yeah.
towards, likely in the next 12 to 18 months. But it's not like you can't get players better without having
Yeah.
data on every single pitch, right? There are some
Yeah.
biomechanists out there. I know you're not one of them, who think that if you don't have data on a certain, like, regular constant data, you cannot
Yeah.
possibly have any sort of action steps. You have no idea what you're doing. There's no way to actually get pitchers better.
Mhm.
So something we're working towards is just being able to have that as an additional layer on top of our current understanding. Like, you can see visually on video, and just working with a player, if they're
Yeah.
flying way open, you can see if their elbows
Yeah.
right by their ear. Like, you can see this stuff on video. It's not
Yeah.
rocket science. Would it be helpful to have that additional layer on top, so that you can get these checkpoints when things are going well, and then be able to see these really subtle, 2, 3, 4 degree
Mhm.
differences over the course of the season? Like, yeah, of course, that would be helpful. And I almost
Yeah.
see that as like another layer on top, to give coaches an additional tool. But there's kind of a theme where certain biomechanists are like, you can't possibly get a player
Yeah.
better without this. And it's like, what did
Yeah.
coaches do 20 years ago? What did coaches do 30 years ago?
Well,
Like, so.
yeah, no, 100%, Ben. Well, one of my favorite things, like when I really got into the weeds with the Dodgers and I started like really trying to understand the physics of the pitching motion. And sometimes I sort of see myself as like a translator between like what coaches say and teach and then like physics and biomechanics. And when I really like approached it from a naive perspective and really got into the weeds with it, I was like, wow, like all of these things that coaches are saying like are right. Like it makes sense. All we're doing, well, not all we're doing, right? People say like the best analyses like confirm what you already know. For 75% of the analysis confirms what you already know, but 25% of it like surprises you and helps
Right,
you learn
right.
something. And that's what I find, where I find with biomechanics, is most of it is just like intuitively what coaches are already thinking and doing. But then there is, the 25% is like, oh, that's really cool. I didn't know that. That's something I can use to make this player better.
For sure. I'm curious. You do have a little bit of a pitching background yourself. Did you play in high school, or just growing up, or in college at all?
Not college. I wasn't good enough, but I did play in, a lot of little league and high school. I played
Okay.
through the end of high school.
Do you find that being able to lean on that does help with interpreting some of the data? Like, how much do you think that's informed your ability to, like, weed out some of the false assumptions in terms of what you're doing, or
Yeah.
provide context? Like, do you feel like if you didn't have that pitching, even playing in high school, if you didn't have that, or you didn't know what throwing a curveball felt like, or throwing a fastball felt like, or how much do you lean on that in terms of being able to filter through some of the data that you're actually getting?
Yeah, it 100% helps, which isn't to say that you need to have played to be able to like analyze and communicate, but it definitely, definitely helped when I like knew what it felt like and I had been coached before to do some of these things. Um, One of the most important things that I did at the Dodgers, before really like, here's an analysis, here's what the analysis shows. What I would just sit in the coach's lounge and just like be a fly on the wall as they're all talking. And like, it's what's so one of the coolest experiences to me is like in spring training or in instructional league, like the day is over for the players and the coaches just sit in the coaches lounge and they talk about pitching and hitting until 10 p.m. at night.
Yeah.
And you can
Yeah.
just sit there and just absorb all of that information. So like me playing certainly helped, but also just sitting there and absorbing all of that awesome stuff that they were talking about just helped a ton. Be able to then communicate is like, oh, here's what the analysis is showing, here's how it relates to what people talk about.
Do you think that the role of a biomechanist should be to be able to make actual practical recommendations, or do you think they should leave that up to the coach? Like, hey, here's the data, here's what it means, but then you let the coach actually decide from there what to do with the players. Like, how do you see the role of a
Yeah.
biomechanist
So
in terms of that?
yeah. So this is a very, very important thing for Reboot Motion is that we are specifically for the coach. You know, different players like internalize things in different ways. They're motivated in different ways. Different cues work for different players. Like every time I've ever tried to go direct to a player, it's gone poorly. Because like, that's not my I'm not a coach. I've never been a pitching coach. So I think it's really, really important to be able to effectively give the information to the coach, but then let the coach be the one to make the call, make the decision on how to make the player better.
Yeah, I always talk about like knowing the boundaries of your competency and trying to stay
Yeah,
within it. Like, I know that I'm not a physical therapist. I know that I'm not a surgeon. So like certain
yeah,
things, it's like you have to be
yeah,
able to defer out, and but also know enough about it that you can know who to defer to and know enough about the context. So you know enough about coaching that you can understand what to
yeah,
share, what context to share it without
yeah, yeah,
necessarily
yeah.
making those direct coaching recommendations.
Hmm. Yeah,
Awesome. Well, cool. I think we've given people a little bit of a, kind of taste of what you're all about. I'm
yeah,
curious if we get a little more into the weeds now for those that are interested. I know I'm certainly interested in picking your brain. One of the things that Reboot Motion is kind of known for and makes them different is you really believe in using momentum in
yep.
your calculations.
Mhm.
So could you, from just a high level perspective, explain to like
Yeah.
the average layperson, like why is using momentum in calculations better or different than how traditional mechanics calculates things?
Yeah. So traditional, like quote unquote, traditional biomechanics has stayed in the realm of like analyzing joint angles, like joint angles at foot plant, joint angles at ball release. The thing is, from a physics perspective, like the angle isn't the thing that determines the velocity. And so there, in traditional biomechanics, people do analyze joint velocities, but the problem also with just sticking in the realm of velocity is the mass of a body part, the person plays a huge role, right? Like people have probably heard, of, or maybe they haven't. I don't know if people have done any physics. You hear about conservation of momentum, but the thing that truly determines how velocity is transferred from like one entity to another entity is the conservation of momentum. That's like a primary part of like what determines how velocity is transferred from one body to the next. So what is momentum? Momentum is, in so many words, mass times velocity. So it's really getting the mass into the equation. For example, I'll just try to give a practical example here. Sometimes like coaches have come to me, they use a system that measures velocity and they're like, especially in hitting, like this 12-year-old is like rotating as fast as the big league average rotational
Right,
velocity.
right.
Why can't this 12-year-old like, hit the ball
Why?
400
Yeah,
feet?
exactly.
And I say, how much does that 12-year-old weigh? And it's like
Yeah,
60 pounds. How much does a major leaguer weigh? 200 pounds. That's why, rotational velocity is not is not created equal
right.
in the physics world.
Yeah, and
Um,
we know when it comes to pitching, and I'm sure certainly for hitters and power as well, body weight is one of the biggest predictors of velocity.
yeah,
So that almost, it's kind of giving us clues as to what you're talking about,
yeah,
as to momentum being the real variable. Um, take me through your thoughts then on like the kinematic sequence when people
Yeah.
get these kinematic sequence graphs where they look at pelvic rotational velocity and trunk rotational velocity and shoulder internal rotational velocity. How does Reboot, or what would your graph do differently? Would it be the same looking graph, but now it's just the equations are a little bit different? It's factoring in momentum instead of just velocity. Um, what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, we make the same graphs, but it's literally momentum over time as opposed to velocity over time. But another really important point about momentum as opposed to something like energy is momentum has a direction. I can literally calculate in what direction is your torso generating momentum. When you analyze energy, you can't understand the direction that energy is being transferred because energy, by definition and in a physics standpoint, doesn't have direction. So literally, when we create a kinematic sequence graph, we are graphing how momentum is changing over time in the direction of the pitching hand. So we're very specifically dialing in the literal thing that is transferring the velocity through your body. So that's how we do it. It's a little bit different than a traditional graph of kinematic
So
sequence.
in theory, with that, you can basically say like, here's like that we talk about like the wave of energy flowing through your body. Like
Mhm.
how
Yep.
seamlessly can you connect the pelvis
Yep.
through the trunk, all the way up through the spine, out into the arm. Like how seamlessly can you transfer that wave of energy out through your body? Your equation would allow you to actually calculate that wave of energy and see where would the break in that wave be, at
Hmm.
exactly which point is that momentum maybe starting to be lost at a higher rate, right? Is that roughly what you're aiming
Yeah.
to do? And
Hmm.
so, is there a way to? I'm sure you already have an answer for this, but a way to see like you're never going to perfectly transfer that momentum through the body. There's
Yeah.
always going to be momentum lost.
Hmm.
You're trying to minimize that amount of momentum lost. You're trying to
Hmm.
capture as much of it as you can. I don't know the number what that would
Yeah.
be, maybe 90% or 80% instead of like 50%. Um, can you or do you have data on a bunch of big league pitchers or hard throwers, and you can compare an amateur thrower and see how they compare from momentum transfer and give coaches the tools to say like, okay, it's the hip rotation where he's losing it, or it's the he's losing it at the arm, or he's losing it at the just before ball release. Can you get to that level of precision currently with your formulas and your equations?
Yeah, that's exactly what we try to do is analyze the efficiency of momentum flowing from the ground to the pitching hand, and then try to give people information about where the athlete might be more or less efficient.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm definitely curious in learning more just myself in the future.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
awesome. Let's shift gears. Let's talk a little bit about UCL injuries. I
yeah,
know you had some research in the past, and
yeah.
kind of one of your own interests is trying to figure out how do we
Mhm.
minimize UCL wear and tear, minimize UCL injuries, minimize Tommy John. Obviously, huge epidemic throughout the game. I've
Yeah,
had a UCL primary repair myself. I mean, we all know dozens, if not hundreds, of athletes who've had that, and it's almost
yeah.
like a rite of passage for a lot of pro pitchers. Um, but I guess first, for people who aren't biomechanists, they're not therapists, they maybe don't have an
Mhm.
anatomy background. Can we maybe discuss the mechanism by which UCL damage occurs in the first place? So, what exactly is going on in the throw that would predispose a pitcher to damaging their UCL?
Yeah. So when during the baseball pitching motion, the upper arm, the humerus rotates insanely fast. Like some literature studies, like say 7,000 degrees per second. There's evidence that it actually might be upwards of 10,000 degrees per second. So the point is, your arm is rotating super, super, super fast. And when your arm is rotating super, super fast, in particular, your upper arm is rotating super fast, the forearm has to come along for the ride. And the thing is, in order for the forearm to come along for the ride, the connective tissue has to be a part of pulling it along. So in the pitching delivery, that's essentially what happens is the connective tissue between the upper arm and the forearm, one of those pieces of connective tissue being the ulnar collateral ligament, the ligament on the inside of the elbow, the forearm gets pulled along, and if you're pitching over and over again, micro damage in that ligament can build up over time, and eventually, if enough damage builds up, that ligament can fail. I mean, it's hard to say. Most people believe that it's an accumulation of damage over time that causes this injury, but I think it's possible that there are acute events too that could cause this injury as well. But essentially, that's what happens: is that little ligament fails at some point, for a lot of pitchers because the arm is rotating so quickly.
Awesome. So, would you be able to kind of cover the different factors that support the UCL then? So, this obviously all this connective tissue is being stressed as a
Yeah.
result of the throw. The UCL is only one of those factors that actually
Yeah.
stabilizes that gapping effect of
Yeah.
the medial elbow. So, what are the other variables that act to support the UCL?
Yeah. In my brain, I tend to just break it up into like three different categories. So the first category is like ligament. So there's ligament. Ligament connects bone to bone, right? So the ulnar collateral ligament is the primary ligament on the inside of the elbow, the medial side of the elbow, that connects the forearm bone, the ulna, to the humerus, the upper arm bone. So that's one thing. But then there's also, it's not just like the forearm is not just connected to the humerus at like a single point. The forearm actually like sits in like a socket on the humerus. So there's actually aspects of that, like that bony articulation, that osseous articulation, that just by its structure actually keeps the elbow stable. So the bones themselves actually play a role in allowing the forearm to stay attached to the humerus as the humerus is rotating really quickly. And then the thing that I spent a lot of time studying in my PhD is all of the muscles. So there's a bunch of muscles, wrist muscles, finger muscles, that cross right over where the UCL crosses, so they can help the UCL, essentially like take the forearm along for the ride as the upper arm is rotating really fast. So those three categories would be the UCL, so ligaments, bones, and muscles.
Awesome. And so, I know there's research looking at like the loading at which the UCL would tear
Mhm.
it if nothing else were there to contribute.
Yeah.
So if we didn't have the those kind of osseous or capsular
Yeah.
support, we didn't have the muscle,
Hmm.
supporting the UCL. Like what are about those loads where the UCL would, pretty much fully rupture if we didn't have those things supporting it?
Yeah, and I can hear people like screaming about fascia. So sure, we can throw fascia in there. I tend to lump fascia in with muscle, just the way I learned it in my PhD from like a computational modeling perspective. But we can throw that in there as well because I can just envision people screaming about it. um, but yeah. So what's interesting about the way people describe the failure mode of the UCL in literature is they often describe it as a like torque value.
Mhm.
Um, the problem is like, so do you want to get into the weeds on like what is torque right now,
Yeah, so that
or
was my question is like, when you and myself, I'm guilty of this as well, like synonymously using
yeah,
torque and load and stress.
yeah,
What
yeah,
what word should we be using when we're trying to talk about like the amount of that, like the amount of strain, stress, load, torque that we're putting
yeah.
on the medial elbow? What is technically the correct way to think about that?
Yeah, so the ligament itself literally fails because of strain. Like it gets stretched to a point or it gets damaged enough where it like pulls apart. Um, so for ligaments, there's a stress versus strain curve. So what stress literally is the amount of force that ligament is supporting, um, divided by its cross-sectional area. We're going really deep in the weeds here, but that's the thing that's really causing the ligament to fail is the amount of force that it has to support given the area that it has. So when it has to support too much force given the area that it has, then it tears. Um, People often describe the failure mode in terms of torque, but the problem with describing it in terms of a torque, so torque is force applied at a distance. And that distance is the distance from the varus valgus axis of the elbow. So what people don't often talk about is like there could be minor differences in how people define the varus valgus of the varus valgus axis of the elbow, and if you define that axis differently, then your torque numbers come out differently
Right.
because the torque numbers are dependent on calculating the force and also knowing the moment arm of that force. Um, so yeah, so the literal thing that causes the UCL to fail is the stress and the strain on it.
So can we, if we kind of get into that a little bit deeper?
Yeah.
So, um, one of the things that we can bring up is thoughts on like the modus or pulse,
Yeah.
as it's now called, sensor, which is giving us approximate torque. Those torques, my understanding is it's a little bit different than what you might see in like a true biomechanical like laboratory setting. So the
Yeah.
absolute numbers are a little bit different. Again, potentially because
Yep.
they're calculating it those numbers slightly differently. But at the same time, like what are the limitations of a tool like that, of using torque and saying like higher torque equals higher, stress on the UCL? Because we can't know without knowing the cross sectional area of the UCL, we can't actually calculate stress like you said. But what are the limitations of using torque alone from something like a pulse sensor?
Yeah. So there's a lot of uncertainty involved in calculating torque. So the first piece of uncertainty is what I already mentioned, is it requires you defining the axis about which the forearm is rotating. And that's just not a really straightforward thing to do. So if you define the axis about which the forearm is rotating a little bit differently than somebody else's study, you're going to get different torque values. Um, the other thing that's tricky is these sensors, uh, they're not. So the way you calculate torque is by measuring rotational acceleration. Um, but when you have a marker-based system, like you're literally measuring position. So in order to get from position to acceleration, you have to do math. You got to take derivatives. And when you take derivatives, you introduce noise. And then you have to apply filtering to smooth out that noise. So like that whole system of math that you have to do to get from position to acceleration, you have to make choices about how much you filter. And so the choices, people try to standardize these choices, but still, like the math, it just involves like uncertainty and smoothing out noise, which means it's really hard to compare like one torque value versus another if you didn't do the exact same methodology. And even with a sensor, so sensors generally measure like angular velocity, um, but they're still not directly measuring like angular acceleration. So still, you have to do some math to get from what the sensor is collecting to the actual torque value. And just again, that math introduces um, uncertainty in the calculation. So this is why, you mentioned that like the actual torque value that the pulse sensor gives you is different than what you see in the literature, just because the math is different. The actual thing being measured is different. So it's just really, really difficult to standardize these calculations across different systems. So it's really hard to compare one system, the torque value calculated by one system to the torque value calculated by another system, unless you're very sure that your methods are exactly the same.
And now, even if you did, let's say, have like the perfect torque value, what are the
Yeah.
limitations of using that on and assuming like a one-to-one correlation between higher torque and higher, rates of UCL injury?
Yeah, it goes back to the three components that we were talking about earlier that help the forearm stay connected to the humerus during the pitching motion. Is the ligament contribution is one contribution. The UCL is like one contribution, but we also have the contribution of the bones, the capsule. We also have the contribution of the muscles. So this torque value is a measure of the total torque experienced by the elbow. But just because we know the total torque experienced by the elbow, there's still a lot of uncertainty. We don't know how much of that torque is actually stress experienced by the UCL. In order to know that, we would need to know the structure of the person's bones. We would need to know the capacity of their muscles. We would need to know the activity level of their muscles, the strength of their tendons. So there's so much uncertainty in going from that total torque value to the actual load experience, the stress experienced by the UCL. That's just it's you can't really say that one player has a higher torque than another player. That person has higher stress on their ulnar collateral ligament. You just can't say that because there's too much uncertainty.
Right. Well, one thing we can effectively assume though is that if we have less fatigued, better functioning flexor pronator muscles, stronger flexor pronator muscles, at least in an isometric sense,
Yep.
that should theoretically help. It'll contribute more towards reducing some of that loading off the UCL. So
Yes.
something we can control at least as coaches or strength and conditioning coaches, is strengthening the flexor pronator muscles, not pitching in an extremely fatigued state,
Mhm.
Right? Like a weak flexor pronator muscle, at least how I communicate it to my guys, like no different than a fatigue flexor pronator muscle. It's a flexor pronator that is inadequately prepared to actually stabilize the elbow at that specific instance in time. So
Yep.
maybe on pitch 120, if your grip strength is normally like 170, maybe on pitch 120 it's like 110. You're no better than the guy
Yeah.
with a grip strength of 110 who's fresh, because it's incapable of doing the job.
Mhm.
So it's accurate to kind of think of it from that sense, like as the flexor pronator fatigues, the proportion of that of that load that's going to the UCL is going to be higher. That 100
Yep.
Newton meters or whatever, 60 Newton meters, whatever we're going to calculate it,
Yeah.
the proportion of that going to the UCL will be greater the more fatigue that you're inducing, or the weaker the flexor pronator muscles, the less contribution from the flexor pronator.
Yep.
Awesome. Well, this kind of feeds us into the study, or the biomechanical model that you shared with me.
Mhm.
I believe this was like 10 years ago now, but
Yeah.
I know we can get a little bit into the weeds with that. But could you kind of first describe what your purpose was in doing this biomechanical model? The title of the paper was the effect of forearm posture on the elbow varus torque generated by the flexor pronator muscles, implications for the UCL. So what were you trying to uncover with this paper, with this biomechanical model?
Yeah. So it's very, very difficult to study these forearm muscles in a living, breathing person because there's a lot of them in a small area. It's hard to like put instruments in there to measure what they're doing. A lot of people have done cadaver studies trying to measure what these muscles are doing. My research lab, my PhD, one of the reasons I joined the lab is because the lab was very focused on, is very focused on, I think still focused on, um, building a computer biomechanical, a computer simulation, a biomechanical model of the human arm. So that way we can perturb this model in ways we can't perturb a living, breathing person. We can
Mm-hmm.
measure things in this model that we can't measure on a living, breathing person. So the idea here was, if we have a model that accurately captures muscle paths, muscle origins, muscle attachments, can we more granularly understand, if we're manipulating things about the forearm posture, how does that change what the muscles are doing? And that's just really hard to do in a live person. It's easier to do in a cadaver, but still you can measure things in a much more granular way when you do a computer simulation.
So when you basically made a computer simulation, you created this biomechanical model of the arm, of the flexor pronator muscles, of the UCL, and
Mhm.
you pass it through this model, and you were looking at the degree of supination or pronation of the forearm during a throw, and calculating, okay, how able to resist uh, that valgus torque, were these different muscles at different orientations. So basically, like, we know the flexor pronator muscles are extremely important to
Mhm.
stabilize the UCL, or stabilize the
Yep.
medial elbow, take load off the UCL. How does
Mhm.
the amount of supination impact their ability to function in that way? So what did you guys find in that paper? What was the kind of takeaway?
Yeah, so the foundation of this work was my PhD advisor, Dr. Wendy Murray's PhD, which was, she built the initial version of this upper extremity model. And then what I really tried to do was add information about this varus valgus axis. And so that's really where I came in, is I wanted to add this axis and see what would happen if we measured stuff about this axis. So yeah, what we did was, we did a simulation where we just increased the amount of supination in the model, and we increased the amount of pronation in the model, and we looked at how the individual muscle capacities changed. So the thing is, for a muscle, the ability for a muscle to generate force is dependent on how long it is. You
Right.
know, the length tension relationship of a muscle. So that's the essence of what we were looking into. Is, as we rotated, as we pronated, supinated the forearm, how did it change the length tension relationship of their muscles, and that in turn impacts the ability of these muscles to generate a torque to counter the damaging torque that you see in pitching. So that's what we explored.
Yeah. So to translate some of that stuff for
Yeah.
someone who doesn't have a background here, um, the real point for coaches is like, how if we compare like a curveball or a slider or something with more supination,
Yep.
where you're getting around the pitch, with something like a fastball where you're more neutral at ball release, right? More supination, more pronation. How does that
Yep.
impact the ability of your forearm muscles to protect the UCL? And what you're
Yes,
saying
exactly.
is that when you're in more supination at ball release, you're putting your pronator flexor muscles in a greater stretch. When the
Yep.
muscle is at a greater stretch, so you can think about for people listening, like if you're going to do a bicep curl, where is your bicep strongest? It's strongest right around 90 degrees when it's in this neutral
Yeah.
position, like somewhere in the mid range.
Yep.
It's you can't lift as much weight when you're in fully extended or a fully flexed position.
Mhm.
So it makes total sense what you found, which is that in greater degrees of supination, these muscles are not able to contract as well, or as hard,
Yes.
or stabilize as well the UCL. And when
Mhm.
you're in more of a neutral position, like a fastball, they're able
Yep.
to contract and stabilize the medial elbow better, right?
Yes.
To
Yeah,
me,
essentially, yeah, I mean, to boil it down, the more supinated the forearm posture, the less able the muscles were to generate a protective force.
okay, it makes sense when you're thinking about it. Like if you're going to shake someone's hand and try to like turn inwards, pronate, if you're going to try to
Yeah.
pronate hard inwards, you'd probably want to do that from somewhere in a neutral posture. Like you'd be able to
Yeah.
produce the most force there versus being in a completely supinated posture and trying to
Mhm.
create a torque that way. So it
Mhm.
intuitively made sense when I read that paper and I looked at the graph. Um, Implications for that. I mean, we can get into like curveball research
Yeah.
a little bit later on, but what were your thoughts when you found that? Was this something where you're like, we should be potentially more careful with throwing curveballs now that we know like the forearm muscles don't work as well in a ton of supination, or like what were your thoughts when you kind of discovered that?
Yeah, and exactly that is just not necessarily that curveballs are more dangerous. I mean, this gets into the weeds a little bit, but typically what people find is the torque experienced by the elbow when throwing a curveball is lower than the torque experience when you throw a fastball. So the demands on the muscles are actually lower. So like the demand on the muscle is lower, the capacity on the muscle is lower. So it's still hard to say if the risk on the UCL is higher, but still it made me think about uh yeah, maybe curveballs. We got to be a little bit more careful with
Right.
curveballs than we do with fastballs.
So the overall torque the elbow is experiencing on a curveball is it's lower, but at the same time the muscle's ability to protect the elbow also lower. On a fastball, it's
Yeah.
higher torque, higher capacity.
Yep.
So it kind of explains why it might be a little bit of a wash in terms of making a
Yeah.
concrete recommendation about one being more dangerous than the
Yeah.
other. I think that makes a lot of sense. What are your thoughts, just before we get into some of the kind of curveball
Yeah.
data and the practical side? What are your thoughts on splitters? Because there's a little bit of a debate on splitters, and does really spreading the fingers
Yeah.
create more tension at the elbow? Is there an injury risk there? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's a very similar story. You know, in a curveball, like supinating the forearm is the thing that changes the length of the forearm muscles, which changes their ability to protect the elbow. In the same way, when you throw a splitter and you're splitting your fingers out wide, something that I don't know if a lot of people know or think about, like your finger muscles, some of your finger muscles cross all the way down through your forearm, cross your elbow. So splitting those finger muscles out wide also theoretically impacts the length of those muscles, their ability to generate force at the elbow. So it is theoretically possible that the finger posture associated with the splitter does change the muscle's ability to protect the elbow.
Something that makes me think about is like sprinters who constantly get hamstring strains and they're in a
Yeah,
ton of anterior pelvic tilt. Guys
yeah,
who are in a ton of anterior pelvic tilt, their hamstring is now always on this
yeah,
fully stretched position, and they're putting a ton of force through it, but it's in this huge stretch position. Versus, you get the pelvis a little bit more neutral. The hamstrings are
yep,
now in a more neutral position. The incidence of hamstring strains potentially a little bit lower. So
mhm,
it's one of those things. I mean, we were talking about before we started recording. Like, is it just the fact that it's different, and that if you build up to it too aggressively, that it's a problem? Or is it the fact that like if someone's been throwing splitters for a long time, maybe they've gradually
yeah,
stretched out their fingers, their body's adapted to that slightly longer, length tension relationship, where splitters might not necessarily be a factor if you've been throwing them for a long time, or is it just a factor? Maybe like for me, I don't have super giant fingers, so like I have
yeah,
to really, really crank a ball in there. I've played
yeah,
around with it, like it doesn't feel comfortable, but someone with a Ronald Chapman splitter, like he doesn't even have to like get a huge stretch. His fingers are just
Right.
so big, he can just
Yeah.
force the
Yeah.
ball, and like like it's probably a different scenario based on somebody whose like fingers have to stretch significantly further versus someone who already has
Yeah.
bigger fingers that can just engulf the ball without even having to
Yeah.
crank it in there.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%.
Awesome. So I want to kind of move on and talk about some maybe practical implications for throwing breaking balls, throwing curveballs.
Mhm.
Really hot topic where parents
Yeah.
want to know like, hey, what age should I start
Yeah.
throwing curveballs for my kid? Is this dangerous? There's a lot of conflicting information, so we've kind of covered a little bit of like what's out there in terms of the research. But could you kind of I don't want to ask you to like summarize all the available research on curveballs, but like, is it a mixed bag? Does it all point towards curveballs being safer, more dangerous? Like, what are your general takeaways from overall what's been found in the research?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of conflicting evidence, and I think because there's just so many factors involved. Um, like we talked about a few minutes ago, when you measure this total torque on the elbow with a curveball versus a fastball, typically you see that that torque is lower on a curveball, because you're throwing generally just because you're throwing the curveball slower. So that involves like fewer or lesser velocity, lesser acceleration, which leads to lesser torque on the elbow. But like we talked about, it's possible that the forearm muscles are less able to protect the elbow when you're supinating in a way to throw a curveball. So maybe, there's a change there, and it's hard to say like whether one is more dangerous than the other. I think and then also like when the survey studies, sometimes it comes out that curveballs, cause more pitchers to be more in pain. Sometimes it turns out there's no difference. So essentially, it's a mixed bag, and I think the reason is just because it's so dependent on the athlete's specific situation, the health of, or not necessarily the health. Well, yeah, the health of the athlete's forearm muscles, the maturity of the athlete. So I think there's just a lot of different factors there where it's hard to give like one recommendation fits all.
Yeah, the I agree with that. And the way that I kind of like to think about it is it's way more of a spectrum, like a risk
Yeah.
spectrum, where there's various risk factors that can be on or off versus
Yeah.
like the binary, like curveballs are good, curveballs are bad. Right, like on the one extreme, maybe you have a kid who's like 10 years old who's
Yeah.
throwing like three outings a weekend, like at his tournament, like throwing 50% of those pitches are breaking balls, and he's like really twisting the doorknob, and he's got zero. He can't even do a push up, and he has no strength
Yeah.
base at all, and like just right, you can check all these risk factors, and it's like, yeah, that's probably a bad idea. Or you could be like, this could be a 12-year-old kid who's he can do some push-ups, like he's got a decent little bit of strength base.
Yeah.
We'll talk about like ramping up the workload. He's been
Yeah.
intelligently ramped up, and he's spinning a few breaking balls and catch play a couple days a week, like just to start learning a little bit of the feel of that pitch. And he's not using them very often in the games. He's not relying on that pitch, and he's not being abused. Those are two very different scenarios, and it's much more of a continuum than a curveballs are good, curveballs
Yeah.
are
I
bad.
mean,
You can't even touch a curveball till you're shaving. Like you hear that sometimes.
yeah.
So we're on the same page from there. There's just so many variables that you have to evaluate, and it's not just all or nothing.
Yeah. I mean, I think, and it sounds like you might want to, this is what you might want to transition to. To me, the more important thing is managing like ramp up, like changes in just how you're in the demands that you're putting on your body, right? Like if you are a kid, a pitcher who's throwing 100% fastballs and you're throwing, 75 pitches every outing, 100% fastballs, then one day you switch to 50% curveballs, all of a
Right.
sudden, like the demands on your forearm muscles is changing a ton, and they haven't had a chance to adapt to that change. I mean, it's the same way. I mean, like if you are jogging, 3 miles a day, and then all of a sudden you do like a monster sprint workout,
Right. Right.
there's
Right.
a good chance you're gonna like pull your hamstring because you haven't trained your muscles to
Right.
do a sprint workout. So to me, it's much more of we need to manage like these transitions in these differences in the demands we're putting on our body.
Right.
You wouldn't like go from 0 to running 10 miles. You wouldn't go from 0 to like benching 300 pounds. You always like ramp up a change in a demand on your body so that your body can adapt to support it. And that to me is the really important thing, is if you want to introduce a new pitch type, you have to gradually ramp your body up into being able to support throwing that pitch type.
For sure. And just to kind of add on to that, one of the things we've noticed and observed, and even in my own throwing, like when you are on ramping an athlete and you start to incorporate sliders or curveballs,
Yeah.
a lot of times they're going to get a ton more pronator soreness in that first week or two. So we can talk maybe a little bit about the mechanism there, but it's you are in more supination, so you're going to have different activations of the different forearm muscles. It's not just a static thing. Like your model pretty much explained this. Like your pronator is on more stretch because why? You're in more of a supinated position. These muscles are being stretched.
Yeah.
So it makes more sense. It makes sense that you would have increased activity in some of these muscles, increased soreness. And so, if you're always, like you said, if you're sprinting, like if you're always sprinting on flat ground and now the next day you're going to sprint a little bit downhill and the next day you're going to sprint uphill, like you're going to be sore in different areas. I think pitchers intuitively, like they're hearing this, like they understand this. Like if they start incorporating or playing with a different arm slot or a new pitch or long tossing or doing pull downs, like changing anything about the positions, the joint angles, like it's going to change how our body actually distributes that stress through the system, even with very subtle changes.
Yeah, I mean, it's something I think any of us who like exercise, like we intuitively know, I do a different workout regimen, I'm gonna be super sore. I do something different. I took a break for a couple months, then I try to do it the first time, I'm gonna be super sore.
Yeah.
Or
even something as simple as like you squat every week, but like I'm going to go a little narrower with my stance this week, or I'm going to go a little wider and sit back a little more. It's like one makes your glutes sore, the other makes your quads completely blown up. And it's something as simple as like 10 degrees out with your toes and a little bit narrower stance, like completely changes how that load is actually being transmitted through your body and how the muscles are contributing to that stress.
People don't think about it very much, but the body is very good at adapting very specifically. So if you're always doing the same thing over and over again, your body's going to adapt very specifically to support that thing. And subtle changes can, like, your body, right? Like if anybody has ever, like I broke my leg once and then I didn't put weight on that leg for a couple months. And then when I took the cast off, my leg was a toothpick. There's a total difference in the ability of my right leg and my left leg to support force. So your body is like really awesome at it. It learned that my left leg didn't need to do anything. So it turned it into a toothpick, right? Your body is just really good at adapting in that way.
So what are your thoughts then on kind of the specifics of how you throw a curveball? So like, let's say you're intelligently on ramping, you're going to throw, 10% curveballs at like 12 years old or 14 years old, or even in high school, and you have a smart plan. Like, do you think there's a difference in terms of the actual, like, you hear like don't twist the doorknob, like don't actively try to snap your wrist, but just kind of keep the wrist in some supination and just come through the ball in a less aggressive twisting motion. Do you think there's any validity to that? Like, what would be the mechanism for why like violently supinating right into ball release might be a little bit more potentially injurious than just holding a little bit of supination straight through ball release?
I mean, anytime, like violently supinating, aggressively supinating, like into ball release is just going to turn on your muscles more, which means they fatigue more. There's more demands on them. It's just it activates your muscles in a much different way than if you're keeping your forearm muscles relatively quiet. You're just like subtly changing your posture. It's just a very different demand on your muscles, and you just got to be careful when you change the demand on your muscles that you are appropriately prepared for that.
Right. Thoughts on like spike sliders or knuckle curveballs? Like if we're talking about how supination potentially limits the ability of your medial forearm muscles to actually stabilize it. One of the ways that we found to teach guys curveballs who struggle with supination, like for example myself, like I'm limited in supination. I've broken this wrist twice. I've had elbow surgery. Like with a spike, you seem to be able to. You don't have to get around that pitch nearly as much. Still create pretty nasty movement. I'm thinking of Lance McCullers, Kyle Wright, guys who have that spike. They're getting more of that movement. They can literally just create the grip and they're thinking fastball. They're just ripping through the
Yeah.
ball. But because of that spike, because of that offset grip, they're
Yeah.
still able to get that nasty spin. It's just maybe more gyro spin and a little bit less true like top spin or side spin. In theory, their forearm muscles would be able to stabilize a little bit better on that pitch because they're not in so much supination. Correct?
Yeah. Yeah. I think so.
Okay. I just know I found that as a very easy pitch to teach.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Because it's not like a completely new feel. It's like, hey, just grip it like this and throw it exactly like a fastball. So maybe
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
something that
Yeah.
people
Yeah, and
listening
you
to
want
this
to
can play
also
with.
helps with perception, right? If you're not like aggressively changing your forearm posture to throw a curveball, if it looks more like a fastball, maybe it's also useful. Maybe it's also more deceptive.
Exactly. Um, let's talk a little bit about these like pitch smart guidelines or risk factors.
Yeah.
Basically, like the official like MLB like published um,
Yeah.
recommendations. So I just want to get your take on these. Number one, overuse and fatigue. So
Hmm.
they've noticed pitchers who undergo elbow or shoulder surgery are 36 times more likely to have routinely pitched with arm fatigue. So this factors in things like pitching more months out of the year, higher pitch counts, acute spikes in workload, which you mentioned, pitching on consecutive days. So do you agree with all those things as kind of being things we want to avoid from a health standpoint?
Yeah. Yeah. I think the well, yeah, just one of the keys is just being mindful of when you're overexerting, like when you are fatigued, when you're pitching like more often than you're used to. Um, Yeah, that to me is the key, is just being careful of, like, pitching through fatigue and overexertion.
For sure. And just to add on to that from my coach's perspective,
Yeah.
uh, same thing we see with like lifting. So if like upper body lifting or even like lower body lifting, but really grip intensive stuff, if
Yeah.
that's not done with a plan in season, that can almost be the same thing. Like if you're doing high rep deadlifts like the day of a start or the day before a start and you're just frying your forearms, or I've
Yeah.
actually seen, this isn't a lifting example, but I had an athlete like 5 years ago, and he was feeling a little bit tight in his forearm, and this was a remote athlete, and he went to his team trainer and had her grassing the crap out of his forearm like right before his start, and then he actually tore his
Oh, man.
UCL in that start. Um, it doesn't just have to be throwing that can induce fatigue, is my point,
Yeah.
or shut down the muscle's ability to function. If
Yeah.
you absolutely beat up your forearm with a bunch of grass into where it's like bruised and just like totally shut down, those muscles also aren't doing their job. Or if you do a
Yeah.
bunch of farmers walk competition, like I'll see strength coaches where maybe they don't have the pitching background, so they're like, we got to get jacked in season, and they have the
Yeah.
pitch doing like these farmers walk competitions, and everyone's forearms are sore the next day, and like two guys get hurt. So just thinking of
Yeah.
it from like a holistic perspective, it's not just throwing that can induce fatigue in those muscles. It can be any number of factors: bad sleep, bad
Yeah.
recovery.
Yeah. In terms of these guidelines, I would be less concerned about, like, total volume in a year per se, compared to just appropriately ramping up and, like, ramping down and periodizing, like, strength versus activity. It's just
Right.
like any sort of, like, exercise regimen is, yeah, manage the on-ramp, manage the off-ramp, give yourself rest when you need rest, allow your body time to adapt. So I'm always less worried about total volume and much more worried about ramping up and ramping down and adequately mixing in rest when rest is needed.
Interesting. Do you have any thoughts about like year-round throwing then, given that a pitcher does factor that in, so they on ramp properly. They maybe do have
Yeah.
some load periods in the off season. Um, like certain pitchers, that even pitchers that have a track record of staying healthy,
Yeah.
like Max Scherzer comes to mind. They really prefer not to completely shut down, but to take maybe a few months away from
Yeah.
competitive pitching. But they're still tossing ball. They're still playing catch a couple days
Yeah.
a week, keeping the arm moving. I know this, starts to get outside of like your direct research realm of expertise, but like just general thoughts on like how those two things kind of compare. Like, do you think that's more of a preference based thing, or some hard rules as far as like pitchers need to take like X amount of time off every single year?
Yeah, I'm always hesitant to give hard rules. I do think it's important for a pitcher to give themselves some time in a year or in a given period of time when they're not stressing themselves at like max capacity. You know, definitely like you keep throwing, right? If you're throwing like below like sub maximal intensity, you know, you're probably not stressing the UCL. At the very least, you're not stressing it in the same way you do in competition, and
Right.
maybe not even stressing it at all. So I think like, you know, you don't necessarily need to take time uh totally off from pitching, but I think periods where you're not throwing max effort all the time is really good for your body to rest, recover, heal, and grow too.
So yeah, so I guess my thought would be like when it comes to different moves in the weight room that we'd be doing, like
Yeah.
if you're squatting, like do you just are you going to take like 3 months off from squatting, or are you just going to have like some sort of deload from squatting at various points throughout the year? You're probably not going to just like stop lifting altogether for 3 months
Yeah.
at some point in the year. So I never fully understood the need to just take like months and months and months off. Maybe when they're like 12 years old, 13 years, like
Yeah.
when they haven't even specialized in terms of baseball, sure.
Right.
But once you're in the college level, the professional level, what I'll often see is guys get so rusty, they get so far away from pitching that like if your goal is to just maintain, you know, just barely maintain, and if you want to take off like 3.5 months and then like on rep in January and just barely get ready in time for spring training or in time for the college season, like that is one approach. It just doesn't give a ton of time to actually make any sort of sustained progress in the off season.
Yeah.
But then the flip side of that as well is that uh, your muscular system will recover a little bit faster, like certainly in season than your ligaments and your connective tissues.
Yeah.
So if you're on like a 5-day rotation and like you recover, you feel like you're not sore and you're like just recover in time for that next start, maybe your muscles are recovered, but maybe your ligament, your connective tissue aren't,
Yeah.
your nervous system aren't 100% recovered in time. So like that would be like the counter argument where like at the end of the season you're not hurt, but maybe there should be a little bit of time at least away from max effort throwing to incorporate some more of like that ligamentous connective tissue, even like just nervous system healing to allow it to catch up a little bit more.
Yeah, yeah, 100%, yeah. It's, the ability of, like, a body part to heal is more or less I mean, yeah, there's a lot of factors, but it's just the amount of blood flow. You know, muscles have a lot of blood flow, they can heal pretty fast, but ligaments, bones don't have a lot of blood flow, it takes them longer to heal. So even though your muscles may be recovered, yeah, your ligaments might be not so recovered. You might need a little bit more time for them to recover.
Awesome. Well, I can just go through the last couple pitch smart recommendations here, just to summarize them for people. The next one they've mentioned is showcases, and this goes straight
Yeah,
back to what you've talked about. And they mentioned here like it specifically has to do with doing showcases at a point in the off season when you're not on ramped for that.
yeah,
So if you're not on ramped and all of a sudden you go to a showcase and you try to impress a college coach or you try to impress a scout, like that's a recipe for disaster. So showcases are a risk factor. They mentioned breaking ball usage, but acknowledge there's a huge ton of conflicting evidence
yeah,
in there. I think we've covered that. They also recommended learning good fastball mechanics before beginning to throw a breaking ball. That goes back to like not just like twisting the doorknob and just
yeah,
throwing your arm into a ton of supination, which an 8, 9, 10 year old who their arm slot is like wildly varying pitch to pitch anyway. Like maybe that's a guy where we start to incorporate breaking balls once they've actually developed some feel for how to,
yeah.
you know, decent mechanical guardrails, as we like to say. I think that's probably a decent place to start. Like 8, 9, 10 years old, probably too young, just from that standpoint, just from that perspective.
Yeah. Yeah, I think he would be okay with me sharing this. I actually think he may have talked about it on a podcast. This is one of the things that, I remember I had a conversation or with Walker Bueller about in spring training. Like, I mean, I don't know if it was me and him one-on-one, but I remember him talking about, uh before he would Walker can throw a ton of different pitch types. He has really
Right.
awesome control of his body. But one of the things that he did specifically talk about is he wanted to master the ability to his fastball mechanics, repeat his fastball mechanics, manipulate his fastball mechanics, really understand his body throwing a fastball before he would start to mess around with all of his other pitch types. So that's something he specifically talked about. I think maybe it was a podcast with Ross Stripling where he talked about this. But yeah, it's something that has come up.
Yeah, and I can relate to that 100%. I always felt like learning these different off-speed pitches was like the final step until you have high level mechanics, until you can efficiently transfer momentum through your body, until you can, you have a, I don't know if you want to call it high velocity delivery, but a highly
Yeah.
efficient delivery and a consistent delivery. Then just learning the feel of how to manipulate your hand at ball release is when you can start to learn and master these other pitches.
Yeah.
But until you have that foundation, it's almost like you're trying to improve these other pitches on like this rocky foundation. You're
Yeah.
like on a ship at sea, like moving around. So
Mhm.
I never personally saw the benefit of spending too much time worrying about all these off-speed pitches until I figured out my fastball mechanics. It was like, well, the
Yeah.
second I changed my arm slot or fastball mechanics again, I'm gonna have to relearn these pitches anyway.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
let's get this one thing down. Let's figure out how to throw, whatever it is, 90, 95 miles an hour, or at least have mechanics that could
Yeah.
elicit
For
that.
me,
Like,
65 miles an hour.
yeah, if it's 65 miles an hour, but it's at like 12 years old, whatever,
Yeah.
it's like a decent sequencing of their body, decent timing, decent sequencing, decent conditioning of their arm, on ramping. I guess I could mention like for kids, like if you're even going to consider throwing curveballs, like can you do 10 push-ups? It's like I understand like 12-year-old kids don't need to be in this crazy strength training regimens, but like that doesn't mean they can't do a few sets of push-ups a week or do something to at least begin to strengthen their body a little bit. They're not going to get super jacked. They don't have the hormones to do that, but that
Yeah.
doesn't mean that they can't get a little bit stronger and their bodies can adapt to some extent. Like, can they do 10 push-ups? Can they do like 10 body weight inverted rows on like ring? Like some very, very, very basic things. Can they goblet squat like a 30-pound dumbbell? Some just very basic stuff can go a long way towards just making sure we have the general strength and conditioning of their actual arm muscles. They mentioned pitcher catcher athletes, so again, kind of goes back to overuse and fatigue, but catchers are making a ton of throws every game. Pitchers doing both just is tough, and I've seen that myself in some of the athletes I've worked with. Higher velocity, right? People don't want to hear that higher velocity increases injury risk, but the unfortunate nature is it does. But at the same time, like that's a huge predictor of advancing through the game. So like, I don't know if you want to speak on that, but I don't see a way to really avoid that correlation between higher velo and higher injury risk, except accounting for all the other risk factors as much as we can.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, it's just like a fact of physics, like in order to make your velocity go up, the acceleration has to go up. And when the acceleration goes up, the torques go up. Yeah, it's just kind of a fact of physics. But it's not to say that you can't throw very fast efficiently. Like, we didn't really talk about it very much, but I do think it's possible to have a pitching motion. I mean, I think maybe it's obvious that it's possible to have a pitching motion where you throw really hard and you don't stress the UCL very much. So I do think that correlation is going to be unavoidable, but I also think with efficient pitching mechanics, you can sort of like reduce the impact of that correlation, of that fact of physics, I should say.
What are your thoughts, I guess just to wrap up, on pitchers who consistently throw below their peak capacity? So like, let's say you have Justin Verlander, like prime Justin Verlander, where he can throw 102, but he's cruising at like 95, versus a pitcher who's, their peak is 95 and they're always cruising at 95. Is there anything that you would suggest like is riskier about the guy who's always throwing at max effort? Like intuitively, as a pitcher, as a coach, like ideally you'd like the guy that could throw hard and also not try, right? Like ideally. But from your perspective, and from this looking at the way that bodies handle and transmit this force, would you hypothesize that the guy who's always at max effort is putting more stress or putting more load or injury risk through the UCL over time?
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable assumption to make. Yeah, I mean, the person who's like, I mean, just by definition, the person who's always at max effort is just going to be gassed, and then the muscles are going to be fatigued. And if they're always at max effort, then the muscles are fatigued, then theoretically injury risk goes up. So yeah, I think that's a very fair assumption.
So the scouts actually did get it right. They want those low effort deliveries. Like, do you think there's any relation there? Like when a scout sees like a guy who throws like DeGrom and it's just so smooth, and so like from a momentum transfer standpoint, like is smoothness the smoothness equal? Like, do you see almost a 1-to-1 correlation between the guys that are smooth and the guys who just like crush your evaluation?
Uh, yeah. So that was what I was going to say. Is I don't know if the visible signs of effort are actually like reflective of like stress on the ulnar collateral ligament. Um, I think somebody who has like the quote unquote like smoothest mechanics still could be at stressing the ulnar collateral ligament. Um, because to me is like the smoothness is related to the like efficiency all the way through the body. Like how
Right.
efficient are you at getting from the legs to the torso to the arm? But even still, the stress on the UCL comes in at the very last step in
Right.
the chain. So you could be smooth all the way up. You could be 100% efficient, even though that's not technically possible. But we'll just say you could be 100% efficient all the way up, and you could look really, really smooth. But then the last instant, the way the arm unwinds is
Okay.
not so efficient, and that could be the thing that makes you at a higher risk for injury.
Right.
So I don't know if like visually it's easy to see who is at a higher risk
Right.
for injury. I mean, but to the initial point is like just seeing somebody who is at max effort all the time, right? They're probably just going to be fatigued all the time. So
Mhm.
maybe that puts them at a higher risk, but it's not necessarily, I wouldn't necessarily say like that means their UCL is by definition at a higher risk.
What would you say? This will actually be my final question. But what would you say to the people that try to pin an injury on a specific mechanical factor? So, is it possible to say this guy got hurt because of X, Y, or Z? Obviously, like you're laughing, and we kind of know the answer. But like, what's your response to that when someone's like, "This guy had an inverted W, that's why he got hurt," or "This is why this guy got hurt"? Like, is it as simple as that, or what's your response to those types of comments?
Yeah, it's just like there's so many things involved in did this person hurt their elbow that it's like it's impossible to pin it on one thing. Especially like one specific mechanical thing. Because like one specific mechanical thing, like maybe their body is really well adapted to their particular mechanics, and therefore like that mechanical thing is fine for one person. Um, so yeah, it's impossible. Like the things that are seem to be more important is again managing fatigue on ramp, off ramp, things like that, versus like pinning an injury on like one specific one specific part of someone's mechanics.
I lied
Yeah.
because I have one more question based on that answer. Um, with systems nowadays, like with Kinetrax,
Yeah.
with Hawkeye, like
Yeah.
when you're getting these regular reports on
Yeah.
pitchers, how much do you look at the fluctuations in that data to try to identify injuries ahead of time? So can you say like, okay, by the sixth or seventh inning, like his elbow flexion angle starts to change, or his arm starts to drop, or release
Yeah.
starts to drop? Like, how much have you looked at that real time data, or even like just over the course of a season,
Yeah.
to potentially try to predict injuries before they happen?
Yeah. Well, and to add a little bit more to my previous answer, this isn't to say that the way someone moves can't impact their risk for injury. Like, of course, the way someone's moving is like impacting the load on the UCL, but I think it's really hard to pin an injury on one specific thing. This was my
Right.
point. Honestly, like because injuries are so multifactorial in our analyses, like injury risk, injury prediction is not like a primary piece of what we analyze. Um, we do monitor like changes relative to baseline, and that's the biggest thing is just understand. What we talk about change is the thing that can cause risk because your body is doing something it's not used to. It can be indicative of fatigue. It can be indicative of the pitcher doing something different. But typically, like thinking about injury risk, it's much more about like how is somebody changing compared to their baseline? How about somebody pitching through fatigue versus like having a red flag? Oh, this elbow angle went into the danger
Right.
zone. Not
Right.
necessarily that. It's more like how is this person changing relative to baseline? Is this person pitching through fatigue?
Yeah. And so your job at this point is just empower coaches and organizations with that data so that their coaches can start to see over time, see more of these patterns, and we can start to draw some better.
Yeah. Like one of the big things that we do is flag changes. And again, I don't know, being now on the outside and not in the room with the coach and the pitcher, I don't know if this is a change that's desired. I don't know why this change occurs, but is occurring, but it's just like flagging changes for the medical staff, the coach, the organization to look into to say, is this change something that's desired or is this change something that's
Right.
not desired? And therefore it's problematic. So that's kind of where we fall on this.
Yeah, it's cool to think about the direction that's heading, and just knowing it's so complex. Like the more you learn, the more you realize like there's a ton going on here. It's really complex, but or at least it's cool to see that you're empowering people with that data to be able to make better decisions, or at least you know begin to learn more about how all these interrelated connections actually manifest themselves. So I think that's really cool what you guys are doing. Is there a way to first figure out which pitchers are the most deceptive? Like given
Yeah, exactly.
given
Right.
how
No,
their stuff
yeah.
in a vacuum plays, how much better are they performing than their stuff in a vacuum should be playing?
Yeah.
That pitcher is
Right.
the most deceptive. Now we can take all these different models that we've come up with and compare them to, does this actually spit out like Josh Hader and
Yeah,
these guys that
100%. Yeah, that's the hardest for me right now, for us, that's the hardest thing is how do we actually measure deception? Like in order to be able to predict deception, we need to be able to measure it.
well,
So,
can you just like can we just pretend that these pitches are coming out of a pitching machine? They're coming out of a certain release side, a certain release height with a certain spin axis and a certain spin rate. And like how would that pitch play is a total isolation of like the limbs and the hair and
yeah.
the like how would that pitch play? And then what's the differential between that number or that FIP or whatever, that
Mhm.
WOBA for that pitch from that tunnel, from that everything,
Yeah.
and how it's actually playing in reality? And maybe that's that pitcher's deception score or something.
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
know. I don't know how you would. I'm not like smart enough to calculate that.
Me
But
neither. This is not my thing. I mean, we at the Dodgers, we had like somebody who made like pitch stuff grades, which were
yeah,
supposed to be somewhat independent. But yeah, but like I think the success of a pitch is very dependent on where it's like where it's released
yeah,
from. I don't know. Yeah, there's a lot. There's a
yeah.
lot to figure out there.
Yeah, like
And
we have stuff plus that we use, weighted stuff plus, then there's
yeah.
execution plus, which factors in like the location. Like there's a lot of variables. So it's like I think we'll learn a lot more about that in the next 5-10 years as people develop better models. But I feel like we're on the cusp of something being able to quantify that.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know how you
I'm not,
train that, but you can at least like scouting wise quantify the value of that.
yeah. I'm just not sure like hiding the ball behind your body. And maybe in extreme examples, but I'm just not sure that that's like a real thing that happens. Um, I think a lot more of it is have you like seen any of these like occlusion studies? Do you know when I say an occlusion study, do you know what I'm referring to?
I'm
I'll
assuming you're
explain it.
not talking about blood flow restriction training, which is also
Nah,
called occlusion training. No, just I'm
nah.
assuming like hiding the ball, how will they hide the ball?
Yeah, so people do it with video. Sometimes people do it live, which is insane. But it's essentially like you show the batter from the batter's perspective, from the batter's vantage point, a video of a pitcher, and you make that video go dark at certain points. Like first you show the batter the entire trajectory of the ball, then you make it go dark midway through the trajectory, then you make it go dark at ball release, then you
You
make
can
it
see
go
when the decision actually happens.
yeah. So the idea is like they do a bunch of repetitions of a person who's done a bunch of these studies. His name is Sean Muller. He came into the Dodgers once and gave a presentation. But the idea is at these different levels of occluding the flight of the ball, does the batter know stuff? Can the batter still know stuff? And turns out like batters can actually um, predict, like expert batters, quote unquote expert batters, can actually predict stuff about the ball flight, even like when you make the pitcher go dark midway through the delivery. So the key takeaway is that batters are gaining information about ball flight from the delivery itself.
Yeah.
which
I would imagine that has to do with like if they've seen that pitcher before, because if they've seen like
yeah,
a certain sample size of 10 or 20 or 30 pitches,
yeah,
they can start to see the pattern. But if it's like their first time ever seeing a pitcher with zero context, like that would be a little different. That reminds me, I know I've seen some sort of research about like expert tennis players, like they start reacting to
yeah,
the serve before the ball is
yeah,
actually even.
exactly. Yeah, it's the
They
same
can
thing.
see like the
Yeah.
posture of the tennis player, and they know to start going in that direction.
But the last thing I'll mention here that is like a pet peeve of mine, and I'll see if I can. It's hard to describe because it's you got to be able to like visualize this stuff. But whenever people like try to measure deception, they'll say like at 50 feet away or 15 feet away from the plate, what is the difference? How many inches apart is like the fastball from the curve, like late break, right? They try to
Right.
like measure a late break, but everybody always measures this stuff in a global XYZ coordinate system. So like the pitching rubber is like 0 y, the y-axis goes from 0 to home plate, the z-axis goes up, and essentially like 1 inch at the mound is the same as 1 inch at the plate. Or like, if a batter's like on the left, on the left side of the plate, like 1 inch over here is the same as one inch in this world that people analyze, like 1 inch is 1 inch. But if we think about our eyes, what do we actually see? There's a reason there's a vanishing point, right? When I look at a road, like that road is not, you don't actually see the road where like the two sides of the road are parallel all the way through till the end of eternity. There's a vanishing
Yeah.
point because 1 inch is not 1 inch to my eye. Like 1 inch is smaller or different depending on how my eyes are seeing it, depending on where I'm looking at it. Like I look at a road from one side, like the vanishing point is in one spot. I look at a road from another side, the vanishing point is another spot. So essentially, like we perceive things in a way such that 1 inch is not 1 inch. Um, so one of the things I explored at the Dodgers was doing like a coordinate transformation into like a spherical coordinate system, which much more resembles the way we perceive things as humans. And I'm really fired up about this. I don't know if I'll ever have time to really dive in. Maybe somebody else will, but I think so much could be unlocked about ball flight just by doing this coordinate transformation. Like for example, I did a really like straightforward proof of concept where I had a right-handed batter and I in from the perspective of the batter, I plotted what does it look like? What does a curveball look like versus a fastball from a left-handed pitcher? What does a curveball versus a fastball look like from a right-handed pitcher? And it's just so stark, like how you can perceive the difference between a fastball and a curveball when you're looking at it from a certain vantage point versus you're looking at it from a different vantage point. So I think there a whole world of metrics could be unlocked if we looked at things a little bit differently, literally and figuratively.
No, it's super interesting. I've never even considered it from that perspective, but it starts to take into account like, you know, optics and like, you know, like neural processing and like this all this visual, like the whole visual field and everything like that. So that makes a ton of sense. Like if we're trying to deceive the batter and be as disruptive to the batter's timing and ability to make
Yeah,
swing decisions as possible, it would make sense that you want to be analyzing it through that specific lens.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So, Jimmy, I want to say thank you again for being on the podcast. This was awesome. I know we nerded out a little bit, so
Yeah.
hopefully people were able to follow along. Where can they find you if they have further questions? Do you have Twitter, Instagram?
Yeah.
Where can they get in touch?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we have a website, a newly redesigned website that's pretty cool, rebootmotion.com. You can go there. You can submit a contact request. Those go straight into our inbox. So we see them all. I'm on Twitter at James H. Buffy. It's really interesting, like why my Twitter handle is at James H. Buffy. It's because like when I first started my PhD, I was like, I should probably like use my real full name like to publish papers. So like my PhD papers are under James H. Buffy. So I wanted my Twitter handle to reflect that. But then I'm like, but in real life, people call me Jimmy. Well, I don't know. So anyway, my Twitter handle is James H. Buffy, but people generally call me Jimmy.
I think Jimmy has a better ring to it anyway. So
Yeah. Yeah.
awesome. Well, yeah, I know you've always been super responsive and helpful. For honestly years now. Whenever I've had questions, so definitely tweet at him. He'll, if you have any questions about this type of stuff, I appreciate what you're doing and I appreciate you being on. And hopefully we'll do this again at some point.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. This was awesome. You're doing awesome work. I love following you. What's awesome, honestly, is I know that you don't have like a research like PhD background, but like yeah, I think it's like we talked about early. It's cool, like coaches, good coaches, like their intuition is just spot on. And I know you've done a lot of research yourself, even though you're not a researcher. But it's awesome to see like what you're doing and how much of it just like aligns with the science, even though you're not necessarily a scientist.
Yeah, we're just trying to find answers, and we're getting there from different angles. And the better I can understand, the kind of the research and the outside angle as well. A lot of it kind of, like you said, like 75% of these things validate what we already like know and observe. But occasionally you're surprised, and there's something counterintuitive, and we can learn from that. So I welcome it. I welcome the discussion. I want to learn as much as I can about the research side. Incorporate motion capture into what we're doing, but at the same time, like always have that grounded coaching expertise and background where if someone came to me and said that like curveballs don't place any more like activation on your pronator, I would instantly be skeptical of that because I have 100 data points, even though they're anecdotal and even in my own body, like that directly contradict that. So having the coaching background and the experience of, training hundreds and thousands of pitchers, between all the coaches at Tread, like we can sniff out the BS pretty quickly. But at the same time, like you want to constantly be learning and, understanding the mechanisms for why these real world applications and observations are actually occurring. So it's fascinating to talk to guys like you and appreciate the perspective.
Yeah. Thank you, Ben. This was a lot of fun, man. We'll do it again.
Yeah, absolutely, Jimmy.